Now back to Just Energy Radio with Dr. Rita Louise.
Hello and welcome back to Just Energy Radio. I'm your host, Dr. Rita Louise, and thank you all for staying tuned to the second hour of the show. In this hour, we're going to be speaking to our good friend Jay Weidner about the moon landing conspiracy. Blech, I can get that out of my mouth. But I have a number of announcements before I bring Jay on. First, our new book, Man-Made, The Chronicles of Our Extraterrestrial Gods, will be in currently. And so on the webpage, www.manmadethechronicles, we are offering a pre-release offer where we're giving free shipping of the book to anyone that orders it before we get hard copies in our hand. Also, the book will be signed by myself and my co-author, Wayne LaLiberty. So take advantage of this offer. I think we're going to extend it until the end of the month, but we should have books in hopefully next week. Woohoo! I'm excited. But manmadethechronicles.com. Also, Just Energy Radio is moving to a new network. Starting on the 19th of October, we will be on the Inception Radio Network. One of the things that I like about that network is that they have a, like Android or iPhone app, so you can listen to the show live streaming on your phone while you're at work. Like if they have that block thing on your computer so you can't get to the website, a little workaround. They're also available on TuneIn Radio. One last announcement, Paradigm Symposium, couple of weeks, Minneapolis, Minnesota. It's a conference you don't want to miss. I'll be there in the exhibitor hall doing readings, hanging out, selling books. But, you can hang out with me and Eric Von Donigan and Georgia Zoukalos and all those, cool ancient alien people, as well as a number of the other good friends of Just Energy Radio. Okay, let me tell you a little bit about Jay and get him on the air. Jay Weidner is an author, filmmaker, and hermetic scholar. Wired magazine called him an authority on hermetic and alchemical traditions. Jay is a renowned author, filmmaker, and hermetic scholar. Wow, that's a duplicate sentence. Considered to be a modern-day Indiana Jones for his ongoing worldwide quest to find clues to mankind's spiritual destiny via ancient societies and artifacts, his body of work offers great insight into the circumstances that have led to the current global crisis. So from sacredmysteries.com, please welcome to Just Energy Radio, Jay Weidner. Hey, Jay, how are you?
I'm great. How are you?
I am doing good. It was so fun to meet you at the Sacramento Paracon a couple of months ago. It was an honor on my part.
Oh, it was an honor to meet you too. It was a great conference, actually.
Yeah, I had a wonderful time. So one of the things we're going to talk about is your new video about Stanley Kubrick, but I don't want to jump to the punch about that because it really has to do with the moon landing conspiracy. So do you think that we explored the surface of the moon? I mean that's the conspiracy. We've gone there and explored the surface of the moon, or we haven't gone there and it's just a big hoax.
Well, I take a third position, which I think is the right position, and in that I think we did go to the moon, but what they showed us wasn't real. And I don't think they went to the moon the way that they want us to think that they went to the moon, which is why they faked it. It's a really problematic. It's not so problematic to get a rocket ship from Earth orbit to lunar orbit, but it's extremely problematic to get men from lunar orbit down to the surface of the moon and then back up safely. The fact that they did it, they'd never done it before in history, never even done a soft landing, that is, use retro rockets to soft land, ever in the history of rocketry until Neil Armstrong did it on the moon, on a foreign alien world where there were many variables, and then get them back is extremely problematic. It just is, and that's one of the reasons why they don't try to do it anymore. So they went, but they used a higher technology, a technology that they don't want us to know about, to get there and to get back. And they collected moon rocks. They put reflectors up. They did all the things that they did. There's probably, lunar rover tracks of some kind up there, maybe even American flags at the 6 places. Those things could all be true, but what they showed us was not real. What they showed us was fake. And the reason that they faked it was, multifaceted. One is that you can well imagine if they had clipped a rock or a boulder, of which there are literally millions all over the moon, if they had clipped a rock or a boulder on their way down, it would have toppled over and they would have crashed and they would never been able to get back, and the entire world would have sat for 6 to 8 days while they literally starved to death and died of thirst. And it would have been the most agonizing thing the world would have ever gone through. And Nixon was president, and he wasn't about to allow anything like that to happen on his watch. And so they, earlier than Nixon, I believe that they decided in 1964 to fake the landings as a safety precaution in case, they decided to not actually show the landings. And so it was purely a publicity stunt in a way. And so this is why the astronauts never did interviews, why Neil Armstrong, who could have been a senator even from Ohio, never left his ranch. He died just a few months ago, and literally he only did 2 interviews in the entire intervening years, over 40 years, and it was reported that you tried to come onto his ranch in Ohio to speak to him, he would chase you off with a shotgun, and and he didn't want to talk about it because he really wasn't a very good liar. And the proof is in the pudding if you go watch the press conference that the 3 astronauts did after the landing. They don't look like 3 guys who achieved something that no one had ever achieved. They look like 3 guys who were very, very unhappy. And they were unhappy because they did not want to lie. Buzz Aldrin wrote a book about his experiences, and in that book he talks about how at the 1-year anniversary in 1970, he was invited to a big thing in Las Vegas. He went with his wife, and he got on stage, according to his book, and you can read it. It's called Return to the Earth by Buzz Aldrin. And on the lecture, a reporter said, "Hey, Buzz, tell us what it was really like to be on the moon." And Buzz, in the book, paraphrasing, says, I couldn't answer the question. I started getting sick to my stomach. I wanted to vomit. I went outside. I immediately left the stage, and I went outside and vomited in the alley and was sick for the next 2 days. Which is a common visceral reaction to having to lie. Human beings are not, lying is not natural to human beings, and except for politicians. And so he doesn't want to lie. And in fact, he's been confronted by people who've asked him to put his hand on a Bible and swear to God that he went to the moon, and he's refused. In fact, he punched the guy out, which is another famous YouTube video. And so, it's just the U.S. government doing what they've been doing since I've been born, basically lying to us, and which is why I can't trust any of them anymore.
And I think that's interesting. I had Edgar Mitchell on the show, and the point of having him on was he had written kind of a biography talking about his work with noetic science and the creation of that. But, of course, since I had him on the show, I had to ask him about, the whole Apollo thing and Apollo 13 and 14. And he sounded pretty convincing, like he had gone to the moon. I mean, he was pretty upfront about his experiences. Yeah,
that's interesting because one of my good friends in my life was Dr. Robert Masters, top hypnotherapist. Worked with Margaret Mead, husband of Gene Houston, wrote several books, scholarly books on hypnotherapy and neuroscience. And I was talking to him once while I was formulating all of this, and he said, well, you know, I hypnotized Ed Mitchell. And I said, really? He said, yeah, he came to me a couple of years after he went to the moon, Apollo 14, and he was a very troubled man, having alcohol problems and things. And he said, I have a big problem, and you need to help me. And Dr. Masters said, well, what's the problem? He says, I can't remember what happened on the moon. And he said, really? He said, would you hypnotize me so I could remember? And Masters told me that they did several very deep hypnosis sessions, and dang, he just couldn't conjure up the memories. And that's a true story. I mean, you know, so and this has been written about by Masters in a book, so I'm not betraying patient doctor confidences here. It was well known that he went to Dr. Masters in hypnotherapy sessions to try to recover his memories of being on the moon. But alas, he couldn't. So I can't tell you any more than that. I can only report the facts. And I think, you know, Dr. Mitchell is a very really great guy, and Institute of Noetic Sciences is an awesome operation, and I'm not trying to disparage him in any way, but that he cannot escape the fact that he could not remember in the early 70s what happened to him on the moon, and that is a very telling remark. I think he's an honest guy, and I think he was mind controlled, and I think he knows it.
Well, I mean, especially if you really like go around that conspiracy theory corner, you know, with the whole noetic science organization becoming popular and him getting out in front of the public, not as an astronaut, but as a representative of this organization, you know, I could see where might be a little hanky-panky so that he could keep his cover. Cool.
Well, I agree. In fact, Apollo 14 is actually the one of the missions that has the most fakery going on. There's a picture of Alan Shepard hitting the golf ball, and next to him in the photograph is Ed Mitchell. Presumably that's who they are in the suits. You can't really tell because they have a faceplate which hides their identity. And then the real question comes, well, you know, who took the picture? I mean, you know, and you know, there's a famous shot of Ed Mitchell standing in front. He's in a crater. It's a wide shot, and Richard Hoagland, the anti-NASA conspiracy guy, he has taken that picture and taken it and put it under a computer and lowered the contrast and raised the gain. And there's all this stuff in the sky behind Dr. Mitchell. And Hoagland says that these are 20-mile-high glass cities that you can't see, except when you rearrange the gain and lower the contrast on the photograph. And, of course, I show that this is exactly the same technique that Stanley Kubrick used in the ape scenes in 2001, which, of course, parallels the production of 2001, exactly parallels the Apollo program. 1964 to 1968 is the production of 2001, and 1964 to 1969 are the first 5 years of the Apollo program. Carl Sagan, a lot of other NASA scientists worked on 2001 while they were working on Apollo, which is also very odd. In fact, the science advisor, Fred Ordway, to Stanley Kubrick, was also the top science advisor to the Apollo program. And apparently, even though they were rushing to get these space launches going, he had enough time to spend over half a year every year in London helping Stanley do 2001: Space Odyssey. And so, you know, my contention is that 2001: A Space Odyssey was a research and development project to allow Stanley Kubrick to create and concoct the exact way that they would fake the Apollo moon landings. And I think I've done a pretty good job. Michael Barra, who is Richard Hoagland's co-author on Dark Mission, had recently wrote a book called Ancient Aliens on the Moon, and on his website he promised that he would put down my theory and show exactly why I was wrong. So, of course, I was one of the first people to buy his book because I wanted to find out what my arguments were, how I was flawed. And I got the book, and I'm very disappointed because there's no mention of Stanley Kubrick or me in the entire book. And my conclusion has to be that Mr. Berra examined my evidence, realized that I had it tight and locked down, and instead of showing where I was wrong, he decided to just ignore me altogether, which is probably a very wise move on his part. And it's not just...
Well, I have him scheduled to come on the show in about a month. Should I ask him for you?
Yeah, please ask him why he didn't include it. He's an old friend of mine. I really like Michael, and I wanted to get into a spirited debate with him on some radio show or something, but alas, that's not going to happen now. So that the whole thing is and it's not just that it was an R&D project, but Kubrick leaves clues throughout his films about it, and one of the things that he uses in his later films to symbolize it is he uses a ball, a white ball. It's either a tennis ball in The Shining, or it's a cue ball in Eyes Wide Shut. And at the end of Eyes Wide Shut, Sidney Pollack is playing pool with himself while talking to Tom Cruise about how he shouldn't mess with the people that rule the world. And at one point, it's classic, he holds up the white cue ball and he looks at it and he says, "There are things that you will never know," as he's looking at it. And it's obvious to me that Kubrick is using white balls as a symbol for the moon in his later stuff, and over and over. And so I'm convinced of it. The topper off of all, and I invite everybody to see Kubrick's Odyssey so that you can see my evidence. But the topper of it all is that in 1973, after Apollo was long gone, Stanley actually managed to procure from NASA 2 $3 million lenses that were specially designed by NASA for low-light satellite photography and get it for free from NASA. And he shot his film Barry Lyndon in candles, using candles as light with these super-fast lenses. And you have to wonder, why is our government giving a filmmaker living in London $6 million in free lenses? And the answer is, of course, is that, well, they owed him some big favors. The last bit of evidence, besides the very physical evidence that I will present, is that I worked in Hollywood for years, and I knew a lot of people in Hollywood, and the whole Stanley Kubrick faking the moon landings is well known among the upper echelon in Hollywood, and it's considered a big joke. And the upshot of that is the film Wag the Dog, in which Dustin Hoffman plays a film director named Stanley, who's hired by the CIA to fake an event, i.e. Wag the Dog. And near the end of the film, Stanley, Dustin Hoffman, brilliantly played by Dustin Hoffman, begins saying out loud, "This is my greatest work. I want to get credit for it." And then the next scene is a newspaper article where Stanley has unfortunately met an untimely death by drowning in the Pacific Ocean. And, and Stanley Kubrick went out on a limb in his film Eyes Wide Shut to expose the rulers of the world, and met an untimely death 5 days after he showed the film to the Warner Brothers executives. I'm not saying that he was murdered, but we just don't know. Either way, there is enough smoke here where there is a fire. I will tell you this, I cannot prove I do not have a smoking gun. It's true that shows that Stanley Kubrick did it. But I do have the smoking gun on how it was faked, using front screen projection and actually using Hoagland's work against him, because Hoagland thinks that the lines and striations that are seen in the skies around the astronauts when he closes down the gain and puts up the contrast are 20-mile-high glass cities that you can't see. I don't know where the dust and stuff settles on the moon. I can't understand why it doesn't settle on these invisible glass cities. But, giving that, I show that actually these are the stitches in the screen that behind the astronauts that you can see when you lower the gain and contrast. And I do that in the film. I take stills and moving pictures from 2001 in my movie. I do exactly what Hoagland did with the Apollo photographs, and you can see the exact geometries around the apes in 2001, which is merely the flaws in the front projection screen sitting behind the apes.
Okay, but for us not movie people,
yep.
What does that mean? Can you kind of go into the technology a little bit? And I just have to ask one question. So there's a YouTube video that is, I think it's called "Faked Moon Landing." And you see Neil Armstrong coming down the ladder, but then he falls, and I think it's pretty funny because basically they're like, we're on the blank and moon, and then they're walking around and this lighting thing falls down, and then one of the little guys walks, one of the set hands walks across the screen. I mean, it sounds like that's kind of what you're talking about. Well, it is what you're talking about, that it was just this whole Warner Brothers production. Yeah, it was, and interestingly enough, he had, unlike other filmmakers, Stanley had two separate studios that he was working at. Interestingly enough, one was where he did all the front screen work for 2001, and the other was where he did everything else. And a very small crew working at the Shepperton Studios where he did the front screen projections. And the other one, he had a big, huge crew. And he spent 2 years of the 4 years working on the front screen projection stuff for 2001, which is about 17 minutes of a 2-hour and 40-minute movie. And then he spends another 2 years from 66 to 68 working on the rest of the movie. And so we can see that he spends most of his time working on a very small aspect of the film, and the reason that he put so much time in there is because he was doing 2 films at once. So I'll try to do this on the radio as best I can. It's a technique called front screen projection, which is the exact opposite of rear screen projection. If you've ever watched old Hollywood films where people are driving in cars and you see the street going by and the windows behind them, and it looks kind of funny and slightly contrasty and things, that's front screen projection. That's literally the actors are sitting in a car, there's a movie screen behind them, and then behind the movie screen is a film projector projecting the street scenes going by. That's the problem with rear screen projection, is that there's a fall off of light as it hits the screen, and so the background images are slightly darker than the actors in the car. And so it's unsatisfying and really it looks fake, and they don't do it much anymore because it looks so bad. But, in the old days, Hollywood didn't know what they were doing so much, and they had to do it. Stanley couldn't do that because you would immediately notice that the background was not the same light as the foreground. So he pulled out a very little-known technique called front screen projection. And front screen projection solves the fall off of light on the screen because it doesn't have to go through the screen. It can reflect off the screen. And so what it is that your actors are standing in front of a screen with props around them, rocks and trees, but the background is just a blank screen. And the projector is in front of the actors, and it goes through a split mirror, and it projects onto the screen behind them, and then a camera is also looking through the split mirror, and it captures the scene, and there's no difference in the light between the light falling on the apes in 2001 and the light falling on the desert background on the screen behind them. So this solved the problem. In fact, many people thought that he had actually filmed the ape scenes in 2001 in a desert somewhere, but that's not true. I've talked to the technicians who worked on it. It was all filmed inside a studio. There are no outside shots in 2001. And this is Stanley perfecting a technique which would become the technique up until George Lucas finally perfected computers in Star Wars, and then front screen projection got junked, and now we have blue screen and green screen photography going in movies, and they don't use it anymore.
So he perfected it. It is well known. He's given credit for, and even got an Academy Award for the special effects, his only Academy Award, and for 2001. And the fingerprint. Now you have to understand, there's a fingerprint that tells you that you're looking at front screen projection, and the fingerprint is this. The actor is standing on a stage with props. So the ground below him is real ground. The rocks next to him are real rocks in the ape scenes. But there's always a barrier. There's always a line between the soundstage floor and the projection screen. You have to cover the edge of the screen so that it's not seen, because it's a giveaway. It's like the magician's sleeve. He can't roll up his sleeve and show you he has nothing up his sleeve, because if he did that, you would see all the props of how he's moving his cards around and where he's putting the little bunny rabbit when he makes it disappear and all that. And so looking at 2001, you can see that Stanley strategically placed rocks and dirt and gravel and things to hide that line. But the same exact technique is used in the Apollo footage. But when you look and you examine the line, that little line between the stage and the screen, you can see that there's a slight focus problem. That the rocks and pebbles on the stage are in focus, but there's a slightly out of focus field right on the other side of this line. And it's always behind the apes in 2001, and it's always behind the astronauts in the Apollo footage. Always. Unless there's nothing behind them at all, which he did sometimes. He filmed them just on a black stage, so you don't see anything behind him, which is also mighty suspicious. And once you see it, you can't let it go. And you can go through all the thousands of Apollo shots that are in the archives in NASA, and I have thousands of fans who are doing this every day, and it becomes so glaringly obvious that after a while you just start laughing because it's so funny. And, I mean, there's never a shot. If there's a background behind the astronauts, there's always this line where the graininess of the background screen is evidenced against the soundstage rocks and pebbles, and it becomes so glaringly obvious. And you have to wonder, if you take a picture of somebody standing in front of a mountain, is there always a little line of landscape behind them? And the answer is no, not really. But in the Apollo shots, there always is, which is problematic on itself because they're being taken. They're supposedly on the mares of the moon, which are large, flat areas where there isn't any hills. That's why they landed there, because it was flat, and they wouldn't have to worry about, the craft toppling over or anything. Yet in the Apollo shots, there's never any flat surface. There's always a little hill, a little riser right behind them. And that's the proof that the signature, the fingerprint that you're looking for. And once you see it, it will never go away.
Well, what about things like them walking around on the moon and the issues with gravity and, them kind of like popping around kind of thing?
Well, they don't really pop around. If you actually watch the astronauts on the moon, none of them ever jump higher than a human being can jump. They never jump higher than about 18 inches, which is what a man in his 30s is in pretty good shape, a standing position, physically good shape, can leap up about, unless you're a basketball player or something, leap up, 18 inches. And they never get any higher than about 18 inches, which is, a little bit less than the foot to the knee on a 6-foot tall man. So they never really do anything fantastic at all. But what's interesting about the moon shots of the guys walking around is that if you put them over, as I'd show you in the film, if you put that over through a cinema program and then you raise the speed, you speed up the action by 1.5 times, suddenly you're watching them moving around just like normal people walking around. So it's obvious that they were filmed in slow motion. But here's the thing that's so interesting about that. If you're in a quarter gravity of the Earth, that's 1/4 of our gravity, all right, you don't move in slow motion. You're moving faster. There's less resistance to your movements. This is evidenced in the movie Apollo 13, where the astronauts are moving around inside the space capsule, Kevin Bacon in particular, and they're racing around, because that's how it would really be in 0G or quarter G. You would be going much, much faster than a human being would on the Earth. Yet in the photography of the moon, of the astronauts, they're moving about a half the speed of a person, as if they're almost like walking through water or through some kind of muck. And Stanley had a big problem. He couldn't really fake 0G conditions without using wires. And I think sometimes he might have resorted to wires, but so he opted to do slow motion. And then he was worried that some scientist probably would say, hey, wait a minute, why are they moving in slow motion? And so he used 2001, which came out almost exactly a year before the landing, to soften our brains up to the idea that in 0G you would be moving slowly. So the stewardess in the spacecraft is moving really slowly in 2001. The astronauts on the ground in 2001 are moving really slowly. And so we got used to thinking that that's how you look when you're in, lower gravity. And so when the astronauts are shown on the moon, they're in the same gravity that they saw in 2001. The real proof, though, that they're not in a lower gravity is the moon buggy. When they're driving the moon buggy, and this is very obvious from the video, and the moon buggy is throwing the dust out the back tires, just like any car or buggy would on a sandy surface, right, on a beach or whatever. But the dust should fly up, 4 times, because they're in quarter G, 4 times the height that the dust would fly up on the Earth. The dust on a dune buggy running around on the sand on a beach in California on Earth will throw up the dust about 2 or 3 feet higher than the dune buggy, the height of the tire of the dune buggy. And that's exactly the same height that the Lunar rover is throwing the dust up, about 2 or 3 feet higher than the height of the tire. Exactly the same conditions and height that would happen on Earth. But on the moon, those plumes of dust coming out of the back of the dune buggy should have been flying up 20, 30, 40 feet into the air. But they aren't. They're just falling right back to the ground after rising up about 5 feet. That's really the proof that they're not in any kind of changed environment.
I'm just going back to the spacesuits for a second. I always believed that they moved so slow because those spacesuits were so cumbersome. And I think that's kind of what people were told or people were led to believe. So I think it's interesting, just this kind of one level of programming that you're insinuating. And then, 2, we don't know what it would be like on the moon. It takes somebody to sit down and go, oh, wait a minute, but it's going to be quarter G, so that sand should be flying further. I mean, the average person wouldn't think about it, and especially in the 60s, wouldn't think our government would lie to us that way.
Well, that's right. It was the 60s, and we were all very naive. But, in order for those guys to be moving slower than they would be on Earth, those spacesuits would have to weigh 4 times their Earth weight. So those spacesuits would have to be, average man, say 160 pounds, an in-shape man. So 500, whatever it is, 4 times 160, 500, 600 pounds. Well, they're shown on Earth in their practicings, and they're not having any sort of serious trouble walking around with those in our gravity. In fact, they look perfectly fine. They did, they were about 50 or 60 pounds of stuff on there, but still, it would add 60 pounds to a 160-pound man. That's 210. You divide that by 25% for a quarter G, and you're still only at 50 pounds. So you have a man with the muscles of a guy on Earth, and he's only moving around 50, including his body weight, 50 pounds of stuff. They should have just been springing all around, jumping around. And when I forget the name of the astronaut who does the salute in front of the flag, and he leaps, he should have been able to leap 4 feet, 5 feet straight up in the air easily, even with his suit on. but he doesn't. He doesn't get any higher than 18 inches. So, the real upshot of this whole thing is that I have never been challenged by anybody, and the film's been out for over a year. I have not been challenged by NASA. I've not been challenged by any of the astronauts. Nobody has challenged me. Everyone has ignored me, and that tells me that I'm right. But let me give you a little story that is very, very interesting. In 1995 or 6, I can't remember, Fox did a special called "We Never Went to the Moon," in which a lot of
I watched that. I
remember that. It was one of the highest-rated shows in Fox history, and some of the material was presented was not correct and all that, but it was actually a very sensationalistic and good show in a lot of ways. Well, James Oberg, who's a top NASA writer, saw the ratings for that show and got incensed. And he went to NASA, because I was following this story very closely. He went to NASA and he said, I want you to open up your archives, everything to me, and I'm the top science writer in the world, and I want to write a book. You give me an advance. I want to write a book proving, beyond any shadow of a doubt, that we went to the moon. NASA said, great, come on in. They paid him $20,000 advance. And about 5 or 6 months later, I didn't hear anything. I know James, and I was following the story pretty closely. I was wondering what was going on, and then I read in the paper that James had quietly given back the $20,000 advance. Well, we never heard any more. He didn't write the book, and I know exactly what happened because it happened to me. In the early 90s, I was working with Richard Hoagland, and I started asking NASA questions about the moon landings. Could I see the designs for the suits? Could I find out what kind of air conditioning system these suits had, because it's 250 degrees above zero on the surface of the moon in the light and 250 degrees below zero in the shadows on the moon. And so we had to have an air conditioner in these suits that could heat and cool the body over a range of 500 degrees. I was interested in what kind of battery could possibly power these suits. And I believed at the time that we did go to the moon. And I couldn't get any traction out of NASA. They would never respond to my questions. They would never help me. I was planning on writing a book about the whole thing. And I'm sure, I have no doubt that Oberg asked the same questions that I did, because he's a journalist too, and he got the runaround. And finally he said, you know what, I'm not going to do this. I'm just going to send you back your money. So, I mean, that's one of the biggest proofs. But there's one other thing that happened, which really bolsters this whole idea. In 1995, Richard Hoagland and I went to one of the top investment firms in the world, and we had 5 minutes to present our plan for this company, this investment firm, to make a whole lot of money, because that's what they do. And I had 2 minutes, and he had 3 minutes. And I got up first for 2 minutes, and the lawyers were already looking at their watches. This is the top floor of one of the biggest buildings in one of the biggest cities in the United States, and they were already looking at their watches before I started. And I presented a plan that we would make an IMAX movie called Return to the Moon, in which we would privately launch a 3D camera that would orbit the moon. It would fly over Hyginus Rill. It would fly over the Apollo landing sites. It would, again, I believe we went to the moon at this time. And it would be an IMAX feature, and we would make gazillions out of it, and the whole thing could be done for a little over $20 million. Well, we were in that office for 2 hours. We had a 5-minute meeting, and it lasted 2 hours. They hired a very famous movie producer to make this film. It was all going forward, and they also hired a guy who trained with Buzz Aldrin and Neil Armstrong to do the diligence on it, make sure that we could indeed launch the thing, make sure that the cameras were indeed going to work, and all the things that we said we were to do, right? And ironically, this guy lived in my town, and I saw him a couple of weeks later, and his name was Frank. And I said, hey, Frank, what's going on with your due diligence? And he looked at me and he said, well, I called up the head of NASA, who's a friend of mine, and I told him that we were going to make this movie called Return to the Moon, IMAX feature, and we were going to send a 3D camera, blah, blah, blah. And the guy said, you're not going to the moon, Frank. No one's going to the moon. If you launch your rocket, I don't care if it's launched out of India or China or in the middle of the ocean, we will blow it out of the sky. And do not ever call me again. And hung up on him. And this is one of his best friends. So again, everywhere you go, every time you try to actually get information from NASA or do something on a private way to prove that they went to the moon, you're stopped by them, not by anybody else. They stop you.
Well, what do you think, kind of going back to Richard's material, of the possibility that there are bases on the moon, or Mike Barr's material that there are bases on the moon? And
well, there are.
And that's what the big cover-up is that we don't go there and we don't want to show what's there.
Well, that might be true. That might be true. Like I say, I'm only a journalist. I can only say what I can show you. I'm not going to rashly speculate. But there is a very interesting thing that has occurred, which is, interestingly enough, Hoagland has never talked about it, and I've asked him why. He's never given me a right answer that I believed. But if you type in okay, I'll start like this. The NASA compiled a report called the Translunar Phenomena Report, and it went back through all of the astronomers back all the way to Galileo, and collected all of their weird sightings through the telescopes that they had seen on the moon, and listed them all, what they saw, when it happened, which astronauts reported it. All the famous astronomers, were in this compilation. Going back for 400 years. And 60% of the strange anomalous activity seen by the very famous astronomers on the moon over 400 years were seen in the crater Aristarchus. What's very interesting is that in '94, the Pentagon launched a military mission called Clementine, which went to the moon and did extensive imaging. And they took 2 shots of Aristarchus, and in the crater Aristarchus is a giant blue dome that's about 10 miles wide. It has obvious geometry in it. They took 2 separate shots of this glowing blue dome and never said anything about it. Nobody ever said anything about it. I saw it. I was stunned. And I couldn't figure out why no one was talking about it, because it was so obviously an intelligent construct. Well, about 3 years ago or 4 years ago, a Earth-based amateur astronomer, and you can get this by just Googling Aristarchus crater blue glow or blue dome, and you can see it for yourself. So I hope everybody's going to their computer right now to look at it. And he got lucky, and he has got a picture of Aristarchus of the blue dome, and it exactly matched 20 over 20 years later. No, I gotta get that right. No, over 15 years later, he captured the same exact blue dome over Aristarchus that had been captured by the Pentagon's Clementine mission. So we have 400 years of anomalous activity being seen at the crater Aristarchus. We have 3 separate images of a blue dome with obvious geometries there. And so I think we can say beyond any shadow of a doubt that there is an intelligent construct that is at the crater Aristarchus that has been there for over 400 years. And, you can take with that what you want. But I have only one conclusion, in that there is intelligent life occupying the moon and has been occupying the moon for a long time. The Greek poet Orpheus claimed that he went up to Mount Olympus to see, because he heard the gods, were up on Mount Olympus, so he wanted to meet the gods. So he climbed to the top of Mount Olympus in Greece. And he got to the top, and he says that a white ship was there, and the gods were there. And they took him into the white ship, and he took off from the earth, and he went into the moon, inside the moon, he said. He said it was filled with glowing mansions with thousands and thousands of, quote, gods, unquote, walking around and floating around, and there was sumptuous food and sensual surroundings, and his conclusion was, 2000 BC or whatever, that the gods lived inside the moon.
And who is this philosopher?
Orpheus, one of the most famous of Greek poets.
I'm going to have to go check that one out.
Mm-hmm. It's very interesting. So Mount Olympus wasn't where the gods lived. Mount Olympus was where the gods landed. And this goes back to my...
Well, actually, Mount Olympus was the name for the home of the gods,
right?
Wherever that happened to be,
right? And this goes back to another pet theory of mine that we are sharing this planet with extremely advanced humanoid creatures, and in some ways we might be their unwitting slaves, in that we might be providing food for them. They come here and they apparently like to abduct women and have sex with them, men too, actually. And there's a hybrid program going on between us and them that they're in control of. And this goes into Anthony Sanchez's work on Dulce and the strange creatures that live there in New Mexico, and right on the Colorado-New Mexico border, and a lot of other really fascinating things. Jacques Vallée's work on UFOs and the strange interactions that we've been having for centuries with some kind of very advanced race of beings. And I believe that that's who's up on the moon, that's who lives underground here, and they have high technology.
Well, I'm going to have to send you a copy of my new book, because that's exactly the topic that the book is all about.
I heard.
And it only looks at it from, well, I don't want to say only, but the core of it is looking at mythology and saying, well, does science match what mythology says? Exactly.
The Greek gods are these crypto-terrestrials, as I call them. They're the Tuatha Danann in Ireland. They're everywhere, and the luminous ones, as the Native Americans call them. They're I forget their name, the Arjuna and all the gods from India. That's who they are. And when all over the world, there's the same reports that human beings had to take their best animals and their best crops, bring them usually to the mouth of a cave or somewhere, and as a sacrifice to the gods. And then it would go away and they'd come back a few days and it'd all be gone. And I'm suggesting that these are these crypto-terrestrials, and we've literally been feeding them and providing sexual partners for them and amusements for them for thousands and thousands of years. And we're just now, waking up, kind of a wake up all at once, like the alarm clock went off, and all of a sudden we all realized all at once that there's an other is sharing this place with us, and in some ways is in charge of the whole thing.
Yes.
Well, I mean, I wish somebody would argue in it, because I would like to get in a good debate with someone, but no one ever wants to take me on. And I think that
that's because you hang out with really cool people that all kind of have the same opinion.
Exactly, and I think we're beginning to reach a group consensus as cool people about what this is, and I think it's wonderful. I used to think that 5 years ago, I did not even believe in aliens. I thought it was all a big trick by the U.S. military. But, slowly over the time, I've over the last 5 years, I've had to face up to the idea that there is indeed an advanced race of humanoid-looking people, whatever they are, that are here who may not have our best interests at heart, by the way. And about a year ago, my wife is really into kirtan singing, which is ancient Indian, from India, call and response singing. It's a lot of fun with, tablas and sitars and things. It's really a fun thing to attend, and I'd never been to one, and so she wanted me to go. And so I went, and everybody was clapping and singing, and it was really fun. But then about halfway through the concert, I started actually paying attention to what we were singing. And I realized that these kirtan, these songs from ancient India, were slave songs. They were songs by the slaves praising their slave master. So it would be, oh Arjuna, we give you the best of our animals. Oh Arjuna, we give you the best of our crops. Oh Arjuna, we are so blessed that you take the food that we make for you. Oh Arjuna, if you want my daughter, you can have her. Oh Arjuna, if you want my son, you can have him. And I'm like, wait a minute, what's going on here? And I finally explained it to my wife, who's somewhat of an Indian scholar. I said, these are slave songs. Just like in the South, the slaves would, make up these songs about how great their master was, so their master would give them more food and stuff when they were hungry, and because he was in control of their lives essentially, and it was a kind of a groveling kind of thing, and that's what these are. And so then I started looking all over the world, and I found out that these things are all over the world. These kinds of cultural artifacts are everywhere. They're in Africa. They're in Native American culture. They're in Europe. They're everywhere. And the same thing with sacrificing your best animals and your best crops. Just think of the story of Cain and Abel. Cain and Abel bring the god, food, and Cain brings vegetables. And Jehovah says, I don't like your vegetables, but I do like your beef. By the way, these guys really like beef. And
no, they like blood and organ meat.
They do.
It's really weird.
It is. And God tells Cain, I don't like what you brought me, but I sure like what you brought me, Abel. I'll take your cows any day. And then Cain is jealous and kills Abel, right? That's the story.
Barbecue.
Yeah, exactly. It is. And, it even goes to the extent of the gods ordered the Indians, and not the Native American, but the ones in India, they ordered them that they couldn't kill their cows anymore, and that's why the cows walk around the streets of India untouched by anyone, even though people are starving everywhere. And that's because the gods wanted the cows for themselves. I would even go so far as to say that vegetarianism might have been put on by these guys to... You look at the origins of civilization, and you can see that we're put onto a grain-based diet with the beginning of agriculture, and but the gods are getting all the good stuff, and we're getting the grains, we're getting the neurotoxic wheat and the fatty white rice. And
well, I'm going to give you a different spin on that.
Go for it.
A different spin. I mean, one of the things that, people like to say slave species or that we're slaves.
Yep.
Change the word, Jay. Domesticated.
That's it. It's what they did with civilization.
And by making us be agrarian, that we have agriculture, it makes us be sedentary, and it makes us form communities in order to harvest and do all these things, which just add to the level of domestication, because now we're not, quote unquote, wild.
That's right.
Anymore.
That's right. They took us out of the wild. They removed us from our very healthy diet, a hunter-gatherer diet, to a grain-based diet, which keeps us sedentary, which makes us fat, which turns us into makes us lethargic, and in that we were their pacified pets that they could use any way they want. And these creatures are still with us. They're still here with us. They haven't gone away. They're still there, and I think NASA knows this, and I think a lot of people at the top know it. In fact, they've told me they know it. I've had conversations with CIA agents, and they wouldn't actually say it to me, but they would do things like blink every time I was right on a statement. So I would say things, and we agreed that if I was right, you would blink, and if I was wrong, you wouldn't blink. And, the guy's just blinking the whole time.
Jay, I have to tell you, we have 30 seconds left, so do your pitch.
Okay, we got a brand new feature film coming out called Shasta, which is about the return of Kalki Avatar. Go to sacredmysteries.com and look it up. It's going to be a big, huge hit. And you can get my movie Kubrick's Odyssey 1 and its follow-up, Kubrick's Odyssey 2, at that website. And I will have the real one that I'm waiting to put out, Kubrick's Odyssey 3, hopefully in another 5 or 6 months. And it's going to be really devastating.
Well, and then we'll just have to have you back on, because I always enjoy watching your films and talking to you about them. You just need to let me know when you have new stuff come out so we can get you back on.
I I'd love to be on your show. It's a great show.
So, anyway, the music's going to come up. So say the website one more time.
sacredmysteries.com, and you can go to jayweidner.com to read all my weird articles and get my free stuff. JayWeidner.
Great, Jay. I'm going to let you go. I'm going to make my little announcements one more time, and I will talk to you again soon.
Thank you, Rita.
All right, bye, Jay.
Bye.
That was Jay Weidner. His webpage is, oh no, am I still on? Well, I'm going to hope I'm still on. There's the music. Okay. Jay Weidner, his webpage is sacredmysteries.com. But don't forget, in a couple of weeks, we're moving to the Inception Radio Network. That's inceptionradionetwork.com. If you want to pre-order a copy of my new book, Man-Made, The Chronicles of Our Extraterrestrial Gods, you can do that at manmadethechronicles.com. Free shipping, signed by me and my co-author, Wayne LaLiberty. We'll be holding that offer until the end of the month. And so until next week, I'm Dr. Rita Louise. This is Just Energy Radio. Be blessed.
Join host Dr. Rita Louise each week at this time for Just Energy Radio. Point your browser to www.justenergyradio.com for more show information and to contact Dr. Rita. Until next time, remember, it's all just energy.